Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Um, this is a day when I think we ought to fix the world. It needs some repair, and I have two friends with me who are going to help me. I've been spending my spare time, which, I don't have a lot of spare time, but the middle of the night, I tend to wake up and write things about how we need to fix the world order, especially since the war has been going on in Ukraine. It's really revealed to us all the shortcomings and the failings of how we solve global issues. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I just happened to have a schmooze day today where two guys they didn't know they don't know what they're going to talk about, because none of us know what we're going to talk about. They each get to choose what they want to talk about, and they don't know each other either. So we're going to get acquainted today. In fact, I need to get acquainted with both of them. They've both been on my show before, but we're still not really, intimate, close friends yet. And we have to work on that. So I think Alexander McIsaac is in Ottawa. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, you are the new honcho at the World Federalist Movement of Canada, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm the new executive director of the organization.
You are the new Fergus Watt.
That's right, yeah.
Give my regards to Fergus. Where'd he go, by the way?
He's still working in collaboration with our organization. We had this project called Coalition for the UN We Need, which focuses on a lot of UN-based reforms. So he's still the coordinator for the C4UN here at World Federalist Movement Canada.
I had talked to Fergus a year or two ago when they were planning, it was like the 75th anniversary or something, and they were talking about UN reform, as they always do. And yet I thought there would be something that would come out of it, and I didn't hear. I got it from somebody else. So I need to go to the horse's mouth today to get it. All right. And where are you, Réal? In Montreal, is it?
Oh, I'm in Ottawa too. That's why I'm starting to think maybe Alex and I do know each other or have met.
Yeah, I believe we spoke at the last schmooze day that I attended. So.
Okay. You were the Federalist person there. Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
Réal Laverne is recently was the head of the Fair Vote Canada movement. And I see that you were a former public servant, but it didn't say what you did.
All my previous jobs, I was involved in international development field. And then after I retired, I started getting involved solely at first with Fair Vote Canada as a volunteer. And I drank the Kool-Aid at some point and became involved in it virtually full time. It's like you, Meta, I'm a full-time retiree.
Many of my friends are saying we have to get more young people. And I think, no. Young people have other things they've got to handle.
They do,
and,
yeah.
Most young people don't have the time for us. But old people, when people get to be 65, that's the ideal time to catch them, because they're just retiring and they have nothing on their plate. And they still have some energy. And so I believe in old people. So Alex, you're on the defensive today. You are. You have to justify your existence as a young person.
Well, I hope I can bring new ideas from a younger perspective.
Okay.
I used to work at Elections Canada. I was the chief of the Political Entities Support Network, so helping a lot with candidates. But my passion has always been really on the international side of things. So right before then, I did my master's at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs.
You can decide what you want to talk about, and if you want to change the subject, you will, but you're free to. But I am, I have so many things I want to talk to you about that I may be more directive than I should. I've just been reading work by a woman named Hélène Lam. Oh boy, now I can't remember her surname. She's a French woman at Yale, and she is arguing that we should do away with elections. That democracy should be run by sortition, and I thought, well, that's a refreshing idea. I didn't take it seriously for a while. What do you think about that whole idea? Could could a government do away with elections and really establish legislative organizations that are run by lottery? You pick people at random or a stratified random sampling of the actual population of voters, and have them deliberate and make decisions. So, Rael, as Fair Vote Canada guy, tell me what you'd think of that.
Well, that's been done before. The Greeks used to have assemblies formed by sortition. I don't know the details. I suppose it varied over time. And they had, of course, a much smaller group of citizens. It was just the nobles who had any right at all to participate. But they drew it out of a hat, basically. In the modern world, I mean, I don't think you're going to do away with elections. So maybe we could be a little bit realistic here. But the idea of doing things by a sortition is has a lot of momentum right now, but not to replace the legislature so much as a complement to the legislature. So that has more feasibility, I think, and I'm surprised that this lady at Yale wouldn't present it that way. I guess she lives in a world where you can just invent things and not worry about what's practical or not, or what's likely to
I
actually
may
happen.
be misrepresenting her. She's much more cautious than I've made her sound. She isn't recommending that we throw out everything and start over. But,
so this idea of sortition has been put forward by a lot of people, including our own David Moscrop, for example. Dave Meslin has put this forward. Fair Vote Canada has put it forward. Peter McLeod at Mass LDP talks about it all the time. It's called a Citizens Assembly. So that's the basic idea behind a Citizens Assembly. You use it selectively for issues that politicians are ill-equipped to address. So there are certain issues that are just politically poison for politicians, such as abortion in Ireland. They solved it by calling a Citizens Assembly. The Citizens Assembly proposed to rewrite the legislation on abortion to make them, I don't remember if it's abortion on demand or simply more flexible, but to make the legislation more flexible. They went to a referendum on it, and the referendum won. So this was a case where the Citizens Assembly made a recommendation that ended up getting adopted, despite the fact that it went through a referendum, because referendums are a good way to kill things. And other things like Macron had a lot of trouble with the climate change issue in France with the Gilets jaunes phenomenon. And so how did he get out of that? He got out of it by putting climate action to a Citizens Assembly. It's not called that in France, but that's essentially what it was. And so now the Citizens Assembly put forward its recommendations, and the government is picking and choosing to some extent among the recommendations, because there's like hundreds of recommendations, and some of them maybe were arrived at fairly quickly. So legislators have a responsibility to maybe call through the recommendations, but I think a lot of those are being implemented. So that's the kind of issue that you can use sortition, and the device that's being put forward by more and more people across the world and it's being applied more and more is the device of the Citizens Assembly. And it's central to Fair Vote Canada's approach to electoral reform. And I'll talk to you about that. You hit on a topic that I'm very interested in.
Great. Well, it's on my mind a lot. Alex, do you think about such things?
Yeah, no, I don't have the same level of expertise maybe as Rael on this, but yeah, definitely agree with all you said. It does present also its big dangers, but provides a certain element of, a citizen's actual views in government that is impossible otherwise. Yeah, and I've heard very similar, ideas being pitched around that, specifically with the whole Freedom Convoy situation. Yep. I did hear a lot of people also propose for a referendum even on the subject. So,
I hadn't heard that. Explain. It would never occur to me. Why would? Oh my goodness. Okay. Why? I mean, what's the argument for doing that with the truck convoy, right?
I think it was the people I've heard these arguments from were typically in favor of the Freedom Convoy, and they did think, there was a problem with representative democracy, and that is not really the opinion shared by everyone. So I'm not really speaking on behalf of world federalism here in any way, but yeah, it's an interesting topic that, when you're going to use emergency powers like the Emergency Act, uh, why would we not consider other type of democratic or more democratic processes to deal with those issues, was the argument being presented there.
I would have thought, it would take months and months of preparation, and you wouldn't be able to do that quickly enough to act in an administrative capacity.
Exactly. And that's one of the big issues with it. Another issue is similarly, like a referendum is extremely costly. It takes a lot of time to organize. Same issue there, right? And it wouldn't have really dealt exactly with what the Emergency Act could have dealt with by, freeing up the streets and stopping the occupation of Ottawa, basically. But yeah, what's interesting is here, like the ways that we can complement representative democracy, right? And in terms of a world federalist view, what's interesting with these citizens associations or something is there is a proposal for a world citizens association to complement some sort of world parliament. And this would actually present, human views, so real people outside of their nation's, foreign affairs policy, who would provide opinions on certain matters to the either General Assembly currently or a potential future Parliamentary Assembly.
And that's exactly what I'm proposing. So somebody scooped me. All right. Real, you probably must be familiar with that kind of proposal.
For a citizens assembly globally. There was one on the environment that accompanied the last COP meetings, and they provided they did produce a report. It's very challenging when you're doing the whole world, because even if you had 500 people, that would only be 2 people per country. So you might somehow have an image, or you might be able to represent the whole world in a way, but you're not representing the individual countries because you don't have enough people to do that. So I don't know how maybe that's where the concept of a federalized approach might be effective, so that you have assemblies within the country, which might have a couple hundred people, and then they elect a couple of representatives. Maybe, of course, that's representative democracy again, but a couple of people from that entity would then represent the country at the federated level.
Well, that's an interesting thing. The notion of somehow, every system that I've come across where you use different levels of citizens assembly that interact or move ideas from one level or place to another, they always involve some form of elections. Somebody's got to be selected from a body, a citizens assembly or something. And so, you're not really getting rid of the idea of electing people, which is, I know nobody so far has criticized that, but you mentioned David Moskrop,
yeah.
Yeah, I did an interview with him. I wish I could again, but he's changing his hats or something now and doesn't want to talk to me again. But I just thought it was fascinating because I chose him on the basis of the title of his book, which was Too Dumb for Democracy, ? And his argument was the general population is, well, if not deranged, at least not smart enough to vote intelligently. And so ordinary elections are really a farce. I mean, the people who really control things are big names, big powerful people, and other people can maybe have some minor impact. The average person really can't and probably shouldn't vote because they don't know enough. And even I think it's true for you and me. I mean, I know enough about certain things, but if I have to run the economy, I would do a bad job of it because I can't even do my own bookkeeping. So, ordinary things like interest rates and the Fed and what they're doing and all that stuff, it just it leaves me blank. And so, there's certain people who shouldn't be entrusted with certain decisions. And I guess I see the importance of having so-called elites who make, at least give advice. But I think also are kind of like the idea that they should have a pretty big hand in making policy. And so that's why I'm ambivalent, and you're going to have to help me straighten out my head on this issue.
I think it also ties in a bit to nationalist populism, and that we have seen that like emerging around the world a lot. And that's the kind of this, I don't know, frustration at the inadequacy, let's say, of, some of our liberal democratic institutions. And one thing with, populists is that they tend to trample on minority rights and things like that. And another side of populism is always it's very democratic, right? Even though populism can be very damaging and can totally eliminate minority rights, go on the tyranny of the majority, and centralize power, destroy institutions that have been built by previous governments. It's all democratic at the end of the day. It's really that frustration, and it's the people at the end who put their entrust that power into some semi-autocratic ruler. So.
Mm-hmm. Could I qualify that a little bit? I think where you're getting the worst abuses of populism are systems that are semi-democratic. So I'm thinking Hungary, Turkey, United States, the UK, and France. And we had a couple of examples recently of elections in Hungary and France. And now, so it is democratic in Hungary in the sense that Fidesz actually got a true majority of the popular vote. But because the system is only semi-proportional, they now have 2/3 of the seats, which means they can continue amending the constitution at will and and gathering more power onto themselves. So I think that's been very seriously problematic in a number of Eastern European countries that are purportedly proportional, but in fact, they've got some majoritarian features built into the system that means that the winning party more easily gets a false majority government, just like we have here in Ontario, or just like the Conservatives have in the UK. So I think if you can improve your democracies internally, somehow you end up with smarter voters, or at least they look smarter because they make better decisions. And that's one of the things that our evidence in Fair Vote Canada shows. We have a document called A Look at the Evidence, which shows that countries with proportional representation get better policy. And when we talk about better policy, we're talking about the long-term stuff. So it's things like environmental management. That's number one right at the top. It is protection of minorities, social dealing with social inequalities, fiscal management, which you wouldn't expect, growth rates to some extent as well. So all of these things, we do better when we have a more democratic system, and that involves proportional representation. That's my shtick. But I think it could also involve citizens' assemblies for sure as an adjunct to that. And that's what David Moscrop is calling for. He's not suggesting that we do away with representative democracy. I don't think anybody's suggesting that, but that for certain issues and in certain environments, a citizens' assembly is a very, very good complement, and it's way better than referendums. And that's another argument David Moscrop would say. If you want to bring people together in an intelligent way, the Citizens' Assembly is a way to get ordinary citizens to pronounce themselves in a difficult topic area, whereas referendums won't work, not because people are dumb, but because they've got lives. They don't have time to spend 3 or 4 days or several weeks studying electoral reform, to give just one example. So they go to the polls, they may not even know there's a referendum going on, and they'll say, well, I don't know what this is. What's wrong with our system right now? No. And off you go. And the electoral reform referendums, we've lost 7 of them in Canada so far, in one way or another.
Mhm. Do you agree, Alex?
Yeah, no, I'd have to even add on that referendums can also be divisive at times, right? And lead to just further referendums, like especially in Quebec, we've seen that. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, they divide people rather than bringing them together, whereas a citizens' assembly brings them together rather than dividing them, because they're expected to come to a consensus. And it's been amazing in Canada, the cases that we've had, how we brought people together from all sorts of political stripes, and yet they come to a strong social consensus of what they'd like to put forward. So, when you have your final votes on what it is that they're recommending, you've got 95% or more of people voting in favor of the consensus they've arrived at, despite the differences they had when they went in.
Yes, okay. My ambivalence has to do with this. I absolutely take the point that the average voter is not well enough informed to make very good judgments. Unfortunately, as we, if they just go to the polls from after work someday and without any preparation, and that's what most people do, everybody does. But I kind of feel I don't believe that elections work. I don't believe that they come up with good decisions. However, on the other hand, and so therefore I would be reasonable to conclude that therefore Citizens Assembly wouldn't be any better because they're still made up of people who don't have any smarts and or who don't have enough smarts. But I did watch several videos on YouTube of citizens' assemblies that have actually taken place. One was chaired by Judy Woodruff, and it was in California, and took, I think, a whole weekend with maybe 500 people, I don't know, from all over California, a representative sample. And so there was one pretty close video that they showed the deliberations going on for at least an hour or two. And I got to watch everybody speak practically. And I have to say, that really did impress me. I was astonished that the average person could come up with the kind of astute remarks that they exchanged in those conversations. But then I came away thinking, well, maybe this was picked out of 3 or 4 recordings that they made because they were the smart ones and they wanted to show us that it really worked. So I'm still a little bit suspicious that most of the other breakout groups would not have been as impressive as the one I watched. Tell me otherwise, one of you, if you've actually had some experience with seeing how it goes. Is it something that I should be suspicious of, or are many or most of these similar breakout groups in a citizens' assembly as cogent as the one I watched?
I think one aspect that we're missing in this is that even though the selection is done by sortition, there's a couple of things. One is people have to accept to be part of it. So it's like for juries. You don't pick just absolutely anybody to be on jury duty. People can pull out and say they're not available, or people can be even rejected. Now, normally for a citizens' assembly, I don't know if they're rejecting people, but you could. Somebody comes in with a diehard position on something and has rabid opinions about things, maybe that would disqualify a person. So it's just an idea.
Actually, I've been rejected from a jury duty. I think it was a murder. And I don't know. I was told that the lawyer, they can choose, they don't have to explain why they don't want you. But I was told that they don't like academics, that they think, I don't know what we do wrong, but that because I was an academic, they didn't want me.
The general point I wanted to make is that because there's self-selection, so they might send out 15,000 letters, and out of those 15,000, 500 come back as saying they're prepared to do it, and out of that you pick 100. That self-selection aspect means that, if I might put it crudely, the riffraff don't volunteer. They're not interested, right? So you're ending up with people who are more interested. And the other aspect that's interesting about citizens' assemblies, which is something perhaps to watch for as well, is that unlike elected representatives, the sortition representatives, once they're done, they're done. So they don't have necessarily any accountability. That allows them to take a public interest perspective on things, but it also allows them to be more radical than the politicians would tend to be. So the recommendations that come out of citizens' assemblies tend to be quite far-reaching and ambitious.
That's
well
very
known.
Interesting. Ah, yes. So this is a general phenomenon that you see that.
Yeah.
Now, that's another thing that does come up in Hélène. I wish I'd written her name down, but I don't think it's available to me here. She's a professor at Yale. Anyway, they talk a lot about accountability, and that one reason for having elections is so you can throw the rascals out. If somebody who's really done a bad job, you can dump him. And but in fact, they don't dump people very much. So she doesn't put a lot of faith in the value of elections as a way of holding legislators accountable. Although she does say that there's more of an argument for it as a way of picking people for the future. It's not punishing the bad guys, but maybe selecting the better ones. I don't know. Tell me, is there, let's say if you have a citizens' assembly, there isn't really any way of holding people accountable, is there? They've done their job, they go home, and that's the end of that. What about the whole notion of accountability? Is that a problem?
I don't think so, and it doesn't have to be. This is why the Citizens' Assembly is a complement to the legislative process. And I would not call on elected representatives to abdicate their responsibilities just because there's a Citizens' Assembly. So they don't just blindly accept what the Citizens' Assembly proposes. They have to put it through the filter of pragmatism and practicability and that kind of thing. So I think that remains an important and legitimate role for legislators, provided that they acknowledge where they're in a conflict of interest. And try themselves, to honestly reflect the public interest and not their own interest, which is always a big challenge when it comes to electoral reform. So I don't think it's a big issue. I would say that the facilitators have an important role to play. If the assembly is going off on a bad tangent, then they maybe can call them back. There's experts that will be involved as well. It's not just we tend to think, oh, this is just Joe and Mary ordinary, but in fact there are experts that they call upon, and the facilitators play a role as well. So I mean, it's kind of a guided process in some ways, without being biased. You can do that.
Sorry?
The structure of it can really change as well, right? Depending on what type of proposal is being put forth. So in terms of the World Citizens Association, for example, it wouldn't even be like a fixed, citizens association. It would just be like a place where citizens can put forth submissions for proposals that would later go to the UN. So it would really just provide a more direct channel to participating in the UN activities for world citizens, as we say. But yeah, there are a lot of considerations in there.
Picture that happening. This would be a regular body run by the UN, but sort of open to people off the street if they want to come in and have their say, or how do people get selected for such a thing?
Well, that's the thing, right? It takes various shapes and forms. So some of them would be more of the way Rael described it, its own little, these citizens that are selected and also have volunteered for this with their own rules on, removing people from that association, etc. And that would be a more fixed system. But there is also this other element of just submitting proposals to have people's voices heard if they want to submit that. And they wouldn't really be, a fixed body that meets every month or so. It would just be this thing that people can participate through. And I did find, by the way, the name of Hélène Landemar or Landemar.
Yes, she is French. Spell it.
It's Helene, Landemore. So
Landemore, yes. Okay, I should
remember.
remember.
I think, you're referring to her lotocracy, I think.
Well, you know, there was a book that she wrote, co-authored as a debate about democracy with a guy who basically said, democracy it depends on people being smart, and they're not. And, you know, the argument that troubles me, because I thought he really made the case. I mean, he used a lot more empirical evidence than she does. She talks theoretically and sort of a priori reasoning, whereas he uses a lot of evidence. And it's pretty damning, you know. The quality of the human mind is pretty deficient. And I think that unfortunately goes for everybody. We've all got holes and gaps in our capacities. And but at any rate, they really did debate about whether or not you can fix it by having more democracy. He took the position that we need to have less democracy, and he would therefore have more decisions being made by bodies of experts. And she refers to a book I haven't read, but I want to get now, by Daniel Bell, in which he defends the Chinese approach. Of course, China historically was known for having a meritocracy. They had examinations. People would pass them in order to get a job, as one of the ruling elite. And they still have a version of that, where they have made, many of the policy decisions in China are developed by people who have some very specific expertise on that limited topic. And Bell apparently thinks that they are really showing us up, because they're doing things that, well, of course they have this spectacular success in their economic development over the last 20 or 30 years, which is astounding. But whether or not you can blame it or accredit it to their governing system, I don't know. We want to comment on that?
I think in a lot of situations, of course, experts, they have more expertise on the subject. So by definition, they would tend to make better decisions. But sometimes they'll also ignore those, little things that might affect civilians and might cause outrage at the government. But yeah, the big thing here for me, though, is really legitimacy that I'm thinking about. And democracy does provide that legitimacy, and you can mix it with expertise through representative democracy by having these norms where, the people that we elect actually listen to expert advice and then make good policy. And that legitimacy is really what's lacking actually in the entire international sphere, right? Because most international organizations are led by experts, and that's why no one considers them legitimate in any way. They don't have that tie to the people having elected them. So in the same way that the Chinese state can be very, expert based in terms of its decision making, it lacks that legitimacy in the same way.
Well, it's more than legitimacy too, because her argument is based heavily on some sort of, I think it's more than a theory. I think it's an empirical discovery that collective decision-making, where you draw on extreme diversity, as long as the people making these deliberations act independently, they tend to come up with better decisions just because they are really representing the whole spectrum of opinion, including non-expert opinions. And this whole, the example that's usually given is, one of the Galton or somebody said he did a report on a thing he ran into at a county fair where there was an ox or something, and all the people coming by were asked to guess the weight of the ox, and they had experts who were experienced in handling oxen and so on. Everybody made guesses, but the average, when they took the average of the whole 1,000 people or 10,000 people or whoever voted, it turned out to be within 1 pound of the ox's real weight. And the same thing has been true for other things. You can ask people to guess how many jelly beans there are in a jar. And if you get enough people independently judging, they will come very close. Their average will come to very close to the real amount, much closer than candy experts, for example, or somebody who should theoretically know more. So I think that there's a mathematical formula for this, but part of the conditions under which this works is that the people make independent judgments. Obviously, somebody guessing the weight of a cow is not going to consult very widely and take the opinions of other people before voting. They'll just do it off the cuff. But in a real democracy, people are colored by the opinions of their friends. And I think this is, to me, the most serious critique of the whole notion of a citizens' assembly or any other kind of real democracy where the people make the decisions, because there's group dynamics. And if you've ever been in a situation where group dynamics are operating, you can see that even very, very smart people who you would certainly think would have better judgments than that, can be brought along into reaching a conclusion that the group may reach collectively that makes no sense. I mean, I've seen it happen in ways that just appall me and make me realize, oh boy, that's just dangerous. If it happens in a small group, it certainly explains what's happening in terms of identity politics now. People voting for people of their own ethnicity or against people of some religious tradition that they don't admire, or something. They think in groups, and they reach their conclusion in groups, and they feel they have to be loyal to their group when they vote. So, I think that's a real strike against the whole notion. And I hope you can disabuse me of that conviction, one of you.
What you were talking about is the wisdom of crowds. And part of the wisdom of crowds is wisdom that's achieved as people deliberate and exchange ideas and try to develop something better than what you went in with. Personally, I find that whatever I'm involved in gets enriched when I talk with other people and when I'm challenged by it. And I think that's a pretty universal phenomenon. And therefore, I strongly believe in the power of deliberation in these citizens' assemblies. Now, you do have, I forget who it was who talked to me about this. Somebody talked about the leadership bias that you want to be careful about. If you have a fairly small assembly and you have a couple of strong leaders in there, they can, as you point out, sway the crowd in one particular direction. So you need to find a way to make sure that you have a range of leadership. And I think the role of the facilitator is extremely important in that respect. I think the idea of having something that's federated if we were doing, let's say, a citizens' assembly on electoral reform in Canada, I would imagine a federated approach where you're going to have a BC chapter and an Alberta chapter and a Quebec chapter and so on, so that there's an internal discussion, and then people who are elected at that level or who've been named ahead of time to represent that level would then go to the National Assembly and carry those ideas over. And then you'd be sure to have a range of leadership rather than having a very narrow leadership in one or two people. So I think there's ways of dealing with this.
Mm-hmm. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, if I could bring this more to the international scale, I don't mean to detract from what you said again. Sorry, but yeah, you're talking about the wisdom of the crowd, right? And this kind of ties back to what you were saying, Meta, about, democracy. Can we really trust people to make these decisions? And how, when we actually deliberate on issues together, we can actually come to good collective decision making. Is there a possibility, and this is something we're reflecting on because of the United Nations Parliamentary Assembly concept, where we would directly elect people to the UN? What about having two separate federal elections? So basically copying the Canada Elections Act into a separate copy, but specifically for foreign affairs. So in that way, we would basically create more deliberations around foreign affairs. We'd have specific elections where people would deliberate between each other on foreign affairs topics. And that would also provide much more legitimacy to our UN ambassador that we'd send there.
Yes, but what they do in a real election is I do not, and you do not have much contact with people who disagree with us. I would talk to my friends and they would agree with me, and we'd all strengthen each other's convictions and then go vote, the way we've decided to vote collectively. That's the problem. Whereas the Citizens Assembly is meant to be to build in diversity so that it's really representative. And that deliberation, it may be that that's the difference, that if you're deliberating with a group of people who are all diverse and you've promised to try to respect each other's, in at least be civil to each other, maybe you can come up with better deliberations that way. But what I'm worried about is people deliberating with their cronies and then voting on the basis of the outcome of their thinking. And we all do. We all live, as they say, in bubbles, social bubbles. I have only met 2 people in my whole life who actually voted for Trump, even though I have American citizenship. I don't go there much, but I should know. But I've never met anybody. So I don't even really know from conversations how people think who are different from me. And that's pretty typical, I think.
Yeah, it's extremely typical, especially in the age of social media, right? Where people literally their Facebook news feeds, Twitter news feeds, everything is based on who they like. And if they see something in their news feed they disagree with, a lot of people will just say, I don't want to see this. And they have their own profile basically for all their different social media accounts on what they see and what they don't. And I actually make an active effort to, try to get both sides of the story and try to not push away friends that, have conflicting opinions. And even sometimes I try to break these like YouTube algorithms and everything when I'm on YouTube and just click on a random video. And sometimes I regret that because I'll get recommended a ton of other like extremely like conservative news or extremely leftist news. It's very interesting if you try to play around with the algorithm. And I think it's a mental exercise a lot of people should engage with.
Let's talk. You want to talk about the UN, and I do too. I believe that, in fact, the Secretary General did write something called Our Common Agenda or something like that, a report on thoughts about, and from various sources, about UN reform. And one of the things that was pointed out to me that was news and of interest is that one of the proposals that he made in that document was that the trusteeship council be converted into something like a multi-stakeholder organization. Now, this is like 1 or 2 sentences. He does not explain how it would work, but it clearly would include everything from, or at least not clearly, presumably would include everything from Fair Vote Canada and my organization, Project Save the World, and Peace Magazine, and maybe the Anglican Church, and maybe the Shell Oil, all kinds of corporations and entities. That anything that is a stakeholder, and everything is a stakeholder, of course. So tell me, this seems to me very promising ideas, but some risks too, particularly the risk that big and dynamic and powerful organizations would tend to prevail there, as they do already in normal life.
And even other international organizations, right? The power of the P5 tends to make its way through the Security Council, through the General Assembly, through every single institution, and they all link in some way. Just like they do with the IMF, right? The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the United States is the only one who holds a legitimate veto in those proceedings. So I definitely agree that whatever type of reform path we would take at the UN, we would definitely still see that institutional inertia that's built in through the Security Council, and permeates through other organizations. Not sure what you think, Riel, but yeah.
It's challenging for sure. I keep thinking when we discuss all these things, you can't ignore democracy at the national level. If you don't have democracy at the national level, you're not going to get global democracy either. And we have serious problems with many of our democracies, starting with the US. Some of the stuff you read on the US, not just in the news on a daily basis, but the in-depth analysis of how frail that democracy is really quite astounding. And, it's a serious problem when the US is also a world leader at the same time. So, world leaders right now, you got Russia, China, the US. These aren't exactly bastions of democracy, So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. We can't, here in Canada, change the US way of doing democracy, but we could improve ours and give a better model of how it can be done. We already do that in a lot of respects.
Is that how you'd start? Because you just threw down a huge challenge. We have to fix all three of the major, superpowers now, and at least the ones that are causing the most trouble. And how do you even begin to do that? I wouldn't say that the fastest way would be to demonstrate to the world how good Canada is and hope they catch on. There needs to be something more ambitious about intervening quickly. What would you do about it? Either one of you.
That's what I'm doing, Meta, is I'm working on Canadian democracy, trying to get proportional representation, and I'll take it wherever I can get it. Last week, I wrote a submission to the Yukon Special Committee on Electoral Reform. Who knows? Maybe that'll have an influence. I've spent the last year pretty much of my life getting ready for the upcoming Ontario election, because I think it creates a very special opportunity to get electoral reform out of the next government, provided that we can prevent Doug Ford from getting a second majority, which is not an easy task. So they're all long shots, unfortunately, but I think that's everybody starts where they feel they can make an influence, and that's where I'm focusing.
Yeah, I'd go kind of the other way around, where, yeah, of course, I see that, you need a democracy in order to get a global democracy. You need it nationally to go globally. But you can also work that process the other way around with the global influences, right? Or the world influences on national democracies. And one of the reasons why we're talking about the US democracy, what we're doing right now, it also puts pressure, and there's, more consciousness now in, American civil society about the flaws in American democracy. And those discussions are, propelled a lot by some of the reports. We rank countries around the world based on their democratic status. So I think that has a big influence. And there are other ways as well you could get in there. You could get in there with oversight of elections, which nations obviously typically reject because they don't want to be under that scrutiny and be ashamed of any misdoings in their own democratic proceedings. But I do think, yeah, it works both ways, in my opinion, where global democracy can influence national democracy and protect it even, and vice versa.
The war in Ukraine is a war about democracy. That's why everybody's supporting Ukraine. It's
Most wars
battle
are, right?
Between authoritarianism and democracy.
Governments being toppled constantly. That's usually the case.
Okay, so you actually think the most promising place to go is to try to fix the US. I think that is really the hardest place to start. I don't know how to, I'm a US citizen as well as a Canadian, but I really can't see any opportunity there. It looks to me like everything is so solidly, the party system. For one thing, I don't even know whether I think it's a good idea to have parties. I haven't really looked into the notion of, is there an alternative as a way of, I guess the value of a party is it bundles together issues so that you really vote for a whole package of issues, theoretically, if you vote on issues at all, which most people don't. the notion is that the party makes packages or combinations, and that without that, people would really be dazzled and confused about whom to vote for because there's so many different issues flying around. So, would you change the party system in the U.S. or where would you, tell me, give me help, help?
Well, number one is you have to make it possible for new parties to actually win, which right now is impossible in the US. You have two choices, both of them are bad. So you've got a really serious issue there. So what fair voters in the US are fighting for are reforms to the electoral system that would allow the vote to be counted differently. So ranked ballots, for example, would allow a third party to be elected on occasion, or ranked ballots also in the primaries would allow less extreme candidates to be elected. That's tinkering in the US. But I do think it's important that, look, there are parties everywhere in the world. And the best functioning democracies are democracies that have more parties rather than fewer parties. But when you have more parties, you have more choice. So I think you have a more real democracy when you have 5 or 6 or even a dozen parties that you can choose from. You don't have that in the US, not seriously.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. It's like really an idea of like giving place to more parties rather than have 2 parties dominate the entire system, like proceeding, and then you have really no actual nuances there in the views. So proportional representation would be a step towards that, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually something, your question, Meta, that I've gotten quite a bit when I was at Elections Canada, which is, there's this big fad, we could say, around independent candidates, right? And a lot of people feel like they could be better represented by independent candidates. And some of these independent candidates I've spoken to, have talked about just abolishing parties and making everyone an independent candidate. Well, in that case, you wouldn't really be an independent candidate because that would defy the purpose of that. And we also have to think about how we can actually form a government, right? So would we elect different independent candidates at that point who would then, after being elected, decide how to form government? Or so we have to think about that whole process about who gets to actually make the final decision, who gets to be in government.
Mm-hmm. Go back to the UN because there have been lots of discussions in the last couple of years about UN reform. Well, there always is, but it's an ongoing process. But tell me what you think, each of you think is the most promising proposal for making a real impact on the functioning of the UN.
The main thing there in the UN and in any international institution is that legitimacy component. So for the United Nations General Assembly to get some sort of legitimacy and to be able to actually have the respect of other nations around the world in listening to international law, listening to the rules that currently they prescribe on themselves, not there's no legitimacy there, right? I think that would be the biggest step forward. And
well, how do you do that? What would you do to fix it if it's broken now?
So again, yeah, there are multiple proposals out there, right? And one of the big ones is to have some sort of election-based system for different groups that would represent us in a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. It would most likely not be one country, one vote, although there are proposals for that, just to take into account those regional and population considerations. And yeah, so basically we would probably have a voting group, say, shared with a neighboring state in the United States. So maybe we would take into account like New York or the previous 13 colonies of the US taken with Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. And then the west of Canada would probably share a voting group like Vancouver with California. So yeah, that's the way you kind of break it down and move the UN away from national interests, because national interests can often conflict with world interests, right? So
absolutely. Yeah, that's very interesting. I haven't heard that proposal before. Please, if you know somebody who's written about it, send it to me.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have info on it on our website, actually,
All right.
www.wfmcanada.org. It's called the United Nations Parliamentary Assembly.
Oh, well, I've heard Parliamentary Assembly for years, but I haven't heard that version of it, that you would do it by region rather than nation. It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, because different nations have different populations, right? And it wouldn't be fair to give one vote to China and one vote to Canada and have those votes be equal.
Okay, I'm up for that. Okay, Rael, you get the final word. What would you do to fix the world?
The whole world. I think I've ceased having that ambition. I worry a lot about the state of our democracy. And I'm encouraged by the fact that with the war in Ukraine, I'm not encouraged by the war in Ukraine, but I'm encouraged by the fact that people have stepped forward to bolster democracy. And if you want hope in the world, watch Servant of the People on Netflix if you haven't watched it yet. It is really, really encouraging.
What is it again?
It's called Servant of the People.
Yes, all right.
And it's about a school teacher who gets elected as president of the Ukraine.
Oh, is it played by Zelensky? Is that
It's played by Zelensky, and you watch this and it is Zelensky. You recognize the man, you recognize how he speaks, you recognize how he's trying to be president of Ukraine in the real world. It's fun. I really, really encourage it.
That's awesome. I didn't know the name of that, so I'll definitely check that out.
It's terrific. Do you happen to know David Kilgore? Well, David Kilgore was a Canadian politician.
Oh, David Kilgore. Yes, he just died.
He just died. And I recommended this series to him, and it was one of the things he was doing in his last few days.
Really? Good.
And that was the greatest gift I could give him. Wonderful. Kind of hope. Yeah.
Okay, so we end with an upbeat note, which is lovely. I thank you both. It's been fascinating to me. You've helped clear my head, and I'm sure I'm a better person for it. So thank you very much.
As we are all. Well, thank you very much, Meta. Thank you, Alex.
Bye.
Have a good one.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week and sometimes more. This is episode number 435. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to the website, please look around because we have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down a bit and share your own thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. I'll see you there.